The night was quiet, with only the sound of tires rolling over asphalt breaking the stillness. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee as he scanned the road ahead. It was one of those uneventful shifts where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just another routine evening in a small town that rarely saw trouble. But then something caught his eye. An SUV sped past him just a little too fast for comfort. Mark sighed and set down his cup. He turned on the flashing lights atop his car and pulled out onto the road, following the vehicle. The driver must have noticed almost immediately because they slowed down and signaled to pull over onto the shoulder. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, bracing himself against the cool breeze. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the SUV, mentally preparing for what was usually a mundane exchange. "License and registration, please," Mark said politely, shining his flashlight into the driver's window. The man behind the wheel fumbled nervously but managed to hand over the requested documents. His name was Paul, according to the ID, and he looked like an average guy. Middle-aged, slightly disheveled, maybe running late for something important. Nothing about him stood out as suspicious. But then, Mark glanced into the back seat. At first, he thought it was just a child bundled up under blankets. Kids often fell asleep during long car rides, so it didn't strike him as unusual at first, but as his flashlight beam swept across the interior, something made him freeze. The figure in the back seat wasn't moving, not even breathing. And, when the light hit their face, Mark felt his stomach drop. The skin was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, and the eyes. They weren't closed like a sleeping person's would be. Instead, they stared straight ahead, wide open but lifeless. Yet there was something unnatural about them, unnervingly bright, almost otherworldly. For a moment, Mark forgot how to breathe. He quickly composed himself, trying not to let his unease show. "Who's in the back?" he asked, keeping his tone casual despite the chill creeping up his spine. Paul hesitated before answering. "It's my daughter," he said softly, avoiding eye contact. "She's sick. We're taking her home from the hospital." Mark nodded slowly, though his instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Hospital visits were common enough, but this didn't feel like any ordinary case. There was no medical equipment visible, no signs of recent treatment, just the eerie presence of the figure lying motionless in the back seat. Mark stepped back toward his patrol car, his mind racing. He needed answers, but more importantly, he needed to figure out why this stop had left him feeling so unsettled. As he called dispatch to run the plates, Mark couldn't shake the image from his mind. Something about the girl, or whatever she was, didn't add up, and deep down he knew this seemingly routine traffic stop might be anything but ordinary. Mark stood by his patrol car, staring at the SUV parked ahead of him. The red and blue lights from his vehicle cast an eerie glow on the dark road, making the scene feel even more surreal. His mind kept replaying the image of the figure in the back seat, those glowing, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he was overreacting, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. He glanced down at the license Paul had handed him. Everything checked out so far. The name, address, registration, it all matched up. Still, Mark couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. He decided to walk back to the SUV for a closer look. As he approached, flashlight in hand, he called out to Paul. "Can you tell me more about your daughter? What's her condition?" Paul hesitated again, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His knuckles turned white under the dim light. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "Her name is Emily," he said. "She's been in a coma for years now, ever since the accident." Mark frowned. "What kind of accident?" Paul let out a shaky sigh. "It happened when she was just 6 years old, a car crash. She survived, but—" His voice trailed off, heavy with emotion. "Doctors said she might never wake up, so we've been taking care of her at home. Tonight we were coming back from a checkup at the hospital." Mark nodded slowly, trying to process what he was hearing. A comatose child, that explained why she wasn't moving or responding. But it didn't explain the strange sensation he'd felt when he looked into her eyes. It was as if they weren't empty at all. Instead, they seemed full of some kind of energy, like they were watching him from another world. Curiosity got the better of him. "Do you mind if I take a closer look?" Mark asked, gesturing toward the back seat. Paul hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually nodded. Mark moved cautiously around the SUV, opening the rear door. The air inside felt colder than it should have, sending a shiver down his spine. He leaned in, shining his flashlight onto the figure wrapped in blankets. Up close, the details were even more unsettling. Her skin wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent, like she wasn't entirely there. And those eyes, they stared straight ahead, unblinking, unmoving, yet somehow alive. For a moment, Mark thought he saw something flicker in them, like a faint spark of recognition. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered too, its beam dimming briefly before returning to full brightness. Mark jerked back instinctively, heart pounding. Was it just a coincidence? Or had something else caused it? "Is everything okay?" Paul called out nervously from the driver's seat. "Yeah, fine," Mark replied quickly, though his voice betrayed his unease. He closed the door gently and stepped back, rubbing his temples. This wasn't adding up. Coma patients didn't give off this kind of vibe. There was something else going on here, something Paul wasn't telling him. Back at his patrol car, Mark radioed for backup, explaining only that he needed assistance with a suspicious situation. He didn't mention the glowing eyes or the chill in the air. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him if he did. As he waited, he kept glancing at the SUV, half expecting the figure to sit up or move. But it remained motionless, silent, and utterly mysterious. The longer he stared, the more questions swirled in his mind. Who or what was really in that back seat? And why did it make his blood run cold every time he looked at it? Whatever the truth was, Mark knew one thing for certain. This traffic stop was far from over. As Mark waited for backup, his thoughts raced faster than the flashing lights on his patrol car. He couldn't stop glancing at the SUV, its dark windows reflecting the red and blue glow like a silent warning. Something about this case didn't sit right with him. And it wasn't just the unsettling figure in the backseat. It was the way Paul had hesitated every time he answered a question, the nervous energy radiating off him, and the unnatural coldness that seemed to cling to the vehicle. When another police car finally arrived, Detective Laura Hayes stepped out. She was known around the department as someone who thrived on solving puzzles, especially the ones no one else wanted to touch. With her sharp eyes and calm demeanor, she approached Mark immediately. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone professional but curious. Mark hesitated before answering. How could he explain what he'd seen without sounding like he'd lost his mind? Taking a deep breath, he recounted everything. The speeding SUV, the mysterious figure in the back seat, and the strange feeling that had gripped him since the moment he'd looked into those glowing eyes. Laura listened intently, her expression unreadable. "Let me talk to him," she said after a pause, nodding toward Paul. Laura walked over to the SUV, introducing herself in a warm yet authoritative voice. Paul seemed even more uneasy now, shifting uncomfortably in his seat as she began asking questions. At first, his answers matched what he'd told Mark. Emily was his daughter, she'd been in a coma for years, and they were returning home from a hospital visit. But when Laura pressed further, cracks started to show in his story. "So you've been caring for her at home all this time?" Laura asked gently. Paul nodded, avoiding eye contact. "Yes, ma'am. We didn't want her stuck in some sterile room forever. Home feels better." Laura tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And how has she been lately? Any changes?" This time, Paul froze. His hands tightened on the steering wheel again, and for a moment it looked like he might refuse to answer. Then reluctantly he spoke. "Things have been different recently. Strange things happening around her. Lights flickering, objects moving on their own. Nurses said they felt cold spots near her bed. Some even claimed they heard whispers." The word whispers hung in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. Laura raised an eyebrow but kept her tone steady. Whispers? What kind of whispers? I don't know, Paul snapped, then quickly softened his tone. I mean, I don't really understand it myself. It's like something is trying to communicate. Or maybe it's just my imagination playing tricks on me. I don't know anymore. Laura exchanged a glance with Mark, who stood nearby listening intently. Both officers knew this wasn't a typical case. Whatever was going on here went beyond a simple traffic violation or medical issue. The pieces weren't fitting together properly, and the gaps in the story only added to the mystery. Before leaving the scene, Laura suggested accompanying Paul and Emily to their house to assess the situation further. Paul hesitated, clearly reluctant, but eventually agreed. As they prepared to leave, Mark noticed something odd. The temperature around the SUV seemed to drop sharply, despite the mild autumn night. Frost formed faintly on the windows, and a faint mist curled around the tires. Detective Laura caught Mark's eye and gave him a knowing look. Neither of them said anything, but they both felt it. They were stepping into something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. Whatever awaited them at Paul's house, one thing was certain. It wouldn't be ordinary. And as the convoy pulled away from the roadside, the sense of unease followed close behind, clinging to the group like a shadow that refused to fade. The drive to Paul's house was quiet but tense, the kind of silence that buzzed with unanswered questions. Mark followed closely behind the SUV, his headlights cutting through the darkness as they ventured deeper into the countryside. The road grew narrower, flanked by towering trees whose branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Detective Laura Hayes rode shotgun in Mark's patrol car, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. "This place feels off," Laura murmured, breaking the silence. She wasn't just talking about the eerie landscape. There was an almost palpable heaviness in the air, a weight pressing down on them. Even the radio crackled faintly, though no one was speaking. On the other end, Mark nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You feel it too, huh? It's like something's watching us." Laura didn't respond directly, but her hand instinctively went to the flashlight clipped to her belt. She had seen plenty of strange cases during her career, but this one felt different. There was no clear explanation for what they'd encountered so far, just fragments of a puzzle that didn't seem to fit together. When they finally arrived at Paul's property, the sight did little to ease their unease. The farmhouse stood alone at the end of a long dirt driveway, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields. Its paint was peeling, and several windows were boarded up, giving it the appearance of a place abandoned long ago. Yet lights flickered faintly inside, casting uneven shadows across the porch. A rusty swing creaked softly in the breeze, though there was hardly any wind. Paul parked near the front steps and stepped out hesitantly, glancing back at the officers as if expecting judgment. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the chirping crickets. Laura climbed out of the patrol car, her boots crunching against the gravel. She took in the scene with a practiced eye, noting every detail. The sagging roof, the tangled weeds creeping up the foundation, the faint smell of damp earth hanging in the air. Something about the house felt wrong, like it carried secrets, buried too deep to escape. Inside, the atmosphere only grew stranger. The dim interior was cluttered with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, and the air smelled musty, as though it hadn't been aired out in years. But it wasn't just the neglect that set alarms ringing in Laura's head, it was the cold. Despite the mild evening outside, the temperature inside the house was freezing, sending visible puffs of breath curling from their lips. In the living room, Emily lay motionless on a makeshift cot, still wrapped in blankets. Her pale face stood out starkly against the dark fabric, and those glowing eyes seemed to follow them as they entered. Laura approached cautiously, her flashlight beam steady as she examined the girl, or whatever she was. Up close, the unnatural chill was even stronger, radiating off her like waves of frost. "This can't be normal," Mark whispered, standing behind Laura. His usual confidence had faded, replaced by a quiet dread. Paul hovered nearby, wringing his hands nervously. "I know how this looks," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But I swear we're doing everything we can for her. We love her. Whatever's happening, It's not our fault. Laura turned to him, her expression softening slightly. No one's accusing you of anything yet, mister. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But you need to tell us everything. Every detail matters now. As Paul began recounting more about the recent disturbances, the flickering lights, the whispers, the inexplicable movements, Laura noticed something odd. Shadowy figures seemed to dart across the edges of her vision, vanishing when she looked directly at them. At first she thought it might be fatigue playing tricks on her mind, but then she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. Except there was no wind. Mark noticed it too, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. He exchanged a glance with Laura, both silently acknowledging that they weren't alone in the house. Whatever force surrounded Emily, it was alive, and it knew they were there. The whispers grew louder as night fell, weaving through the shadows like an invisible thread pulling at their nerves. Laura and Mark stayed close to each other, their flashlights cutting through the dimness of the old farmhouse. Paul sat slumped, in a chair near Emily's cot, his face pale and drawn, looking like a man who had run out of answers, or hope. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the floorboards made them jump. At first the noises were subtle, faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. But soon the whispers turned into distinct words, fragmented, disjointed, but undeniably human. "Let me go," they hissed, echoing off the walls. Each syllable sent a shiver down Laura's spine, yet she forced herself to stay calm. Whatever this was, panic wouldn't help. Mark wasn't faring much better. His usual steady demeanor had cracked under the weight of the unnatural events unfolding around them. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting something or someone to emerge from the darkness. "This isn't possible," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Laura ignored him for now, focusing instead on Emily. She knelt beside the cot, studying the figure wrapped in blankets. Up close, the girl, if she could still be called that, looked even more unsettling. Her chest didn't rise or fall with breaths, and her skin seemed almost translucent, like she existed somewhere between life and death. Yet those glowing eyes remained fixed, staring straight ahead but somehow aware of everything happening around her. "Do you think she can hear us?" Laura asked softly, turning to Paul. Paul hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if she's still here at all, or if it's just something else." His words hung heavily in the room, unanswered. No one wanted to voice what they were all thinking, that Emily might not be the little girl lying there anymore. Something else had taken her place, or maybe joined her. As midnight approached, the disturbances escalated. Objects began moving. On their own, a vase slid across a dusty shelf before crashing to the floor. A chair scraped backward without anyone touching it. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. And then came the cold spots, patches of icy air that appeared suddenly, making their breath fog in front of them. Laura tried to maintain control, jotting notes in her pocket notebook while keeping her flashlight trained on potential sources of movement. But even she couldn't deny the growing sense of dread. "We need to find out what's causing this," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed a hint of unease. "There has to be a reason why this is happening." Mark nodded, gripping, his flashlight tighter. "You think it's tied to her? To Emily?" "It has to be," Laura replied. "Everything started when she came back from the hospital, right? That's too big a coincidence." Paul looked up sharply, guilt flashing across his face. "What are you saying? You think we should leave her somewhere, abandon her?" "No one's abandoning anyone," Laura said quickly, raising a hand to reassure him. "But we need to understand what's going on. Maybe there's a way to help her, or stop whatever's attached itself to her." Before Paul could respond, the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered violently, then died completely, leaving only the beams of their flashlights to illuminate the space. In the sudden silence, the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Let me go. Let me go. And then Emily moved. Her head tilted slowly, almost mechanically, until her glowing eyes locked onto Laura and Mark. For the first time, her lips parted and a soft, chilling voice filled the room. You've kept me here long enough. Everyone froze, stunned. Paul buried his face in his hands, muttering prayers under his breath. Mark instinctively reached for his gun, though he knew it wouldn't do any good against whatever they were dealing with. Laura, however, stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. What do you want? She demanded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. Emily, or whatever inhabited her body, didn't answer immediately. Instead, the temperature plummeted further, frost spreading across the wooden floorboards. Then, in a voice both childlike and ancient, she spoke again. Let me go, or join me. The warning sent chills through the group, but it also clarified one thing. They weren't dealing with something ordinary. This was no medical mystery or trick of the mind. They were facing something supernatural, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The room was deathly silent after Emily's chilling words. Let me go, or join me. The air felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere had turned against them. Laura stood frozen for a moment, her flashlight beam shaking slightly in her hand. Mark's grip on his weapon tightened, though he knew deep down that bullets wouldn't solve this. Paul, hunched over in his chair, whispered prayers under his breath, tears streaming down his face. Laura forced herself to take a step forward, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. Who are you? She asked, addressing Emily, or whatever presence lingered within her. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, Emily's head tilted again, her glowing eyes locking onto Laura with an intensity that made her skin crawl. I am what remains, came the reply, soft yet piercing, like a whisper amplified through an empty cathedral, trapped between worlds, bound by grief and guilt. Mark swallowed hard. What does that mean? What do you want from us? Emily's lips curled into a faint smile, though it held no warmth. Freedom, she said simply. But freedom comes at a price. Laura exchanged a glance with Mark. They both understood. They couldn't just walk away now. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't going to let them leave without resolving something. And time was running out. The oppressive energy in the room was growing stronger, pressing down on them like a weight. We need to figure this out, Laura said quietly, pulling Mark and Paul aside. There has to be a way to release her, or at least contain whatever's causing this. Paul shook his head frantically. You don't understand. Every time we try to move her, things get worse. It's like she doesn't want to leave. Or maybe she can't. Laura frowned. That's not entirely true. She just told us she wants freedom. We need to find a way to give it to her, but carefully. With trembling hands, Laura pulled out her phone and began searching for information. She scrolled through local legends, historical records, anything that might explain why this farmhouse and Emily seemed so haunted. After several tense minutes, she found something. Decades ago, the land had been the site of a tragic accident involving a young girl who disappeared without a trace. Locals claimed her spirit roamed the area, seeking justice or peace. Laura showed the article to Mark and Paul. This could be connected, she said. Look at the description. They mention a girl around Emily's age who vanished near this property. Could this be her? Or is Emily somehow tied to her? Paul stared at the screen, his face pale. It's possible. But how? How could my daughter be connected to someone who died years before she was born? That's what we need to figure out, Laura replied. And fast. Returning to Emily's side, Laura knelt cautiously. If we help you, will you leave this place? Will you let us go? Emily's eyes flickered, and for a brief second they softened. Help me break the chain, she whispered. Open the doors, let light in. Laura interpreted this as a clue. Light, openness, it sounded like a ritual or ceremony. She quickly gathered candles, matches, and anything else that might symbolize purification. Together, the three of them, arranged the items around Emily's cot, lighting the candles one by one. Shadows danced wildly on the walls, but the whispers began to fade, replaced by a low hum. As dawn approached, the room grew brighter, the oppressive cold easing slightly. For the first time all night, there was a glimmer of hope. But none of them dared celebrate yet, not until they were sure the nightmare was truly over. The first rays of sunlight began to filter through the boarded-up windows, casting faint golden streaks across the dusty floor. The candles flickered weakly, their flames struggling against the lingering chill in the air. Laura, Mark, and Paul stood in a tense circle around Emily's cot, their faces etched with exhaustion but also determination. They had spent hours piecing together fragments of local legends, deciphering cryptic whispers, and preparing what they hoped would be a way to free, or at least contain, the entity tied to Emily. Laura took charge, her voice calm but firm. "We need to focus," she said, glancing at each of them in turn. "Whatever this is, it's powerful. But we've got one chance to make this work. If we falter, even for a second, things could get worse." Mark nodded, his usual confidence slowly returning as he gripped his flashlight like a lifeline. "What do you need us to do?" Laura pointed to the items they'd gathered. Candles arranged in a rough circle around Emily, salt poured along the edges of the room to form a barrier, and an old book of prayers Paul had found tucked away in a drawer. "We'll start with the ritual," she explained. "Light, openness, purification, it's what she asked for. We have to believe that breaking whatever holds her here will bring peace." Paul hesitated, his hands trembling as he held a lighter. "And if it doesn't? What if this makes her angry?" "It might," Laura admitted, her tone softening slightly. "But staying here isn't helping anyone. Not you, not her, not us. This is our only shot." With that, they began. Laura lit the remaining candles, ensuring the circle was unbroken. Mark opened all the windows, letting fresh morning air sweep into the stale, oppressive space. Paul, clutching the prayer book, read aloud in a shaky voice, stumbling over words but pushing through. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The whispers returned, louder and angrier this time, swirling around them like a storm. "Keep going," Laura urged, raising her voice above the noise. She stepped closer to Emily, holding a lit candle. "Hi. We're doing this for you. Let go." Emily's body twitched violently, her glowing eyes blazing brighter than ever before. Her mouth opened wide, releasing a sound that wasn't quite human, a mix of a scream and a wail that reverberated through the house. Shadows surged forward, clawing at the walls, trying to extinguish the candles. The temperature plummeted again, frost spreading rapidly across the floorboards. Mark lunged forward to relight a candle that had been snuffed out, his hands shaking but resolute. "Don't stop," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. Laura turned back to Emily, her heart pounding. "You don't belong here anymore. You've suffered enough. Go where you're meant to be." For a moment, everything froze. The whispers ceased, the shadows stilled, and Emily's body went limp. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the figure sat upright, her glowing eyes locking onto Laura. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost childlike. And just like that, her body collapsed back onto the cot, lifeless once more. The oppressive weight lifted instantly. The cold faded, replaced by warmth from the rising sun. The candles burned steadily, their flames strong and unwavering. For the first time in hours, the room felt normal. Paul sank to his knees beside the cot, tears streaming down his face. Mark slumped against the wall, breathing heavily, while Laura stood frozen, staring at Emily. Had they truly freed her? Or had something else taken her place? As dawn broke fully, none of them spoke. They simply watched, waiting, unsure if the nightmare was truly over, or if it had merely begun anew. The farmhouse was silent now, the oppressive energy that had clung to every corner of the house finally gone. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the cold floors and chasing away the last remnants of frost. Emily lay still on the cot, her pale face peaceful for the first time since they'd arrived. The glowing eyes were dimmed, almost lifeless again, except this time there was no sense of menace, no unnatural chill in the air. Paul sat beside his daughter, holding her hand tightly as tears streamed down his cheeks. He didn't know whether to feel relief or grief. "Is she free?" he asked softly, looking up at Laura and Mark. Laura knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I think so," she said gently. "Whatever was keeping her here, it's gone now." Mark nodded, though his expression remained uneasy. "Let's hope it stays that way." But even as they spoke, something lingered in the back of their minds, a nagging doubt that refused to fade. Had they truly helped Emily find peace? Or had they unknowingly opened a door they couldn't close? As the morning wore on, the group began cleaning up the remnants of the ritual. Candles were extinguished, salt swept away, and windows closed, against the crisp autumn breeze. Yet none of them could shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. Shadows shifted oddly in the corners of the room, and faint whispers occasionally drifted past their ears, so quiet they might have been imagining things. Laura decided to take one last look around before leaving. She wandered into the hallway, flashlight in hand, checking each room carefully. Most were empty, filled only with dust and forgotten furniture. But when she reached the attic, she paused. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, cluttered space illuminated by streaks of sunlight filtering through cracks in the roof. In the center of the attic sat an old trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Curious, Laura approached and opened it fully. Inside were dozens of photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings, evidence of the tragedy that had occurred decades earlier. There were pictures of the missing girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to Emily, along with accounts of strange occurrences reported on the property over the years. One letter caught Laura's attention. It was written by a woman claiming to be the mother of the vanished child, pleading for answers about her daughter's fate. A sudden gust of wind slammed the attic door shut behind her. Laura spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing except shadows flickering across the walls. For a brief moment she thought she heard a voice, not angry or menacing, but soft and distant. "Thank you." She stood frozen, unsure if she'd imagined it. Then, just as quickly, the sensation passed. Taking a deep breath, Laura gathered the documents and returned downstairs. Back in the living room, Paul and Mark were waiting. "What did you find?" Mark asked, noticing the papers in Laura's arms. She hesitated before answering. "More pieces of the puzzle," she said quietly. "It seems like this land has been haunted for a long time. Maybe Emily wasn't 'cause she was just caught in the middle." Mark frowned. "You think whatever was here is really gone?" Laura shook her head. "I don't know. Some spirits leave when they're ready. Others linger. All we can do is hope we gave her a chance to move on." As they prepared to leave, Paul lingered by Emily's side. "Will I ever see her again?" he asked, his voice trembling. Laura placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "If she finds peace, maybe someday. But until then, hold on to the memories you shared. That's what matters most." With heavy hearts, the group stepped outside into the bright morning light. As they drove away, none of them looked back at the farmhouse. It stood quiet and still, its secrets buried once more, but not forgotten. Days later, Laura couldn't stop thinking about the attic and the whispered words she'd heard. She wondered if they'd truly freed Emily, or if they'd simply awakened something else. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain: some mysteries were never meant to be solved.